Connecticut passed the Clean Slate law in 2021. The law aims to erase certain convictions from people's records after a period of time. It was initially scheduled to go into effect in January of 2023, but the program faced significant delays. Implementation in Connecticut is overseen by the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, or DESP. So where do things stand with Clean Slate today? From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're taking a look at the criminal justice system. Later in the show, we'll hear from researchers who explain what they see as the predatory dimensions of criminal justice. But up first, Maysoon Khan. She's an investigative reporting fellow with the Accountability Project at Connecticut Public. She's been following the latest updates with Connecticut's Clean Slate law. Her team's work has involved lots of interviews and filing requests through the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. She's here to give us the latest updates on Clean Slate. Maysoon, it's great to have you on Disrupted.
Thank you for having me on here. I appreciate it.
Your work has been really important for helping us not just see an issue, but understand the depth and context behind the issue. So as a reminder for our listeners, let us know, what is the Clean Slate legislation here in Connecticut?
Clean Slate is actually an initiative. It is a nationwide initiative. It exists in multiple states, but in Connecticut at least, it basically automatically clears certain criminal convictions. So for felony convictions, certain ones, 10 years have to pass after you've, served your time, and it's automatically cleared from your criminal record. And for misdemeanors, it's 7 years. That does exclude sex crimes and family violence crimes. That was outlined in the state law when it was passed. For those interested, there is a very long list that you can search up, and you can see if you're eligible. It is said to impact thousands of people in Connecticut. Other states have their own versions. Sometimes they outline different crimes that are eligible, but all of it is under kind of the same premise. And the whole idea behind Clean Slate is this idea of a literal clean slate, giving people a second chance. A lot of people who have criminal convictions struggle with employment opportunities, even just finding secure housing. So that's kind of the whole idea behind it, to give these people a second chance, allowing them to pursue whatever they want to pursue without that blocking them.
I remember when this was first signed into legislation back in 2021, there was a lot of excitement because, as you mentioned, there are other states who have similar legislation. Connecticut is a relatively small state compared to those other states. So the potential impact is tremendous given the number of people here in Connecticut. It was supposed to go into effect on January 1st, 2023, but there were a number of delays when it came to actual implementation and seeing that impact realized. What were some of the reasons why we saw those delays from when it was supposed to go into effect to when it actually did?
I think the first kind of on-the-record public comment we got on it going into effect was Ned Lamont coming out and saying, we're implementing the law. People are going to have X amount of criminal convictions erased from their records by this time. And that just simply didn't happen. We FOIA'd, or at least we requested records for internal emails between the people in charge in the governor's office and DESP, which is kind of the department in the state that is overseeing this program. And it looked like there was not clear communication between these departments. And so, you had the governor making these promises, and then you had internal emails with people who are working on this project saying, wait, what's he saying? And so some of the issues just with rolling this out it was all kind of technical issues and data quality issues. The commissioner for DESP, which is the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection, he called this the most complex IT project that the state of Connecticut has ever taken on. For example, in the beginning, they realized there were a lot of false positives, meaning, when they were running some criminal convictions through, the system was clearing convictions that were not eligible for erasure. And obviously, that's a big no-no. So they really had to put brains together, figure that out. They hired outside contractors, like consultants, to come in to just help fix this issue. But yeah, it took years. It took a lot of time.
It's such an important arena to not just hold people accountable, but to help us understand the complexities of all of these units and departments that in many ways may soon don't really talk to one another or have a system that they may use in one state agency that does not interface well with another. Mm-hmm. And I think it's what makes your work, the work of the Accountability Project, so important, is that it's not partisan. It's not a gotcha moment. It's not about let's go after the governor or let's go after this unit. It's really about how do we have the kinds of outcomes that we say we want, given all of these complexities, to have this major IT project, as you mentioned, because at the end of the day, there are people who are waiting for this promise and waiting to see it realized. You mentioned the data, you mentioned the false positives that were generated. Do you have any evidence that mistakes were made, or were these things that they were able to catch before someone was told that they were eligible and to actually have it erased?
I don't think mistakes were made. When this law was being rolled out in the very beginning, I think they erased something. I think it was 13,000 criminal convictions from people's records. And that's when they pumped the brakes, when they realized the false positives were happening. And then we noticed that state officials were just very tight-lipped. They didn't want to make promises or say, hey, we're going to fix this in X amount of time, because they didn't know. And, you had the governor going on the record in the beginning, and that promise wasn't kept. So we noticed just, in the year that I've been reporting on, this year and a half, actually, we noticed they were a bit tight-lipped, even when small developments were made, just because they didn't want to make promises, or if they ran into more issues, that's like another thing. But the one thing we did notice was there wasn't much transparency around public officials talking about Clean Slate. It was very hard to get the governor's office on the record. DESP was great. I mean, they're kind of the people that oversee the program. So they were great at answering questions and just, giving us an update. Even the advocates in the community, they were very crucial in the reporting process, because they regularly met with state officials and with the governor's office, and they regularly got the updates. So they were great because they were able to just, tell us what's going on. And then we were able to go to state officials saying, we know this, this, and this. And then we just needed them to confirm it. It was a good reporting process, and one that couldn't have happened hadn't it been for the people that care about this initiative.
We are now 5 years from when this was signed into law. And you mentioned the people on the ground, the kind of frontline people who, because of their own personal experience or their advocacy on behalf of others in their communities, have been critical to this. What are you hearing now from that advocacy group or that community of people who really want Clean Slate to go forward, not just in name, but actually in impact? What are you hearing from advocates?
I spoke with an organization, it's called Connect. It's a collective of various religious groups all together. And they're actually like the major champions of Clean Slate in Connecticut. And so just in conversations with them, I mean, they're very happy that the state finally got this law to the finish line. I mean, the state is all caught up with most of its erasures, which is big, which is a really, really big accomplishment, because there are states that have Clean Slate and it's hard to implement it. Some haven't yet that have passed the law. So that's just one thing I want to say. I mean, Connecticut, that is a huge accomplishment for the state. What I have been hearing from the advocacy community is that a lot of people who have gotten their records erased, some might not even know it's been erased. I spoke with a woman, her name's Mary Valdivinos. She had a criminal conviction and she was very open. She spoke on the record about it. And she didn't even know it was erased until she got a background check for applying to an apartment. It came back and she saw no criminal conviction and she just broke down in tears. I imagine her experience can resonate with thousands of people because there's no notification process. You have to pay $75 and take the initiative to get your background check to see if it's been erased. So that's kind of a big issue that has popped up now.
And I imagine in the scope of things, as you mentioned, some of the collateral consequences of having a conviction, of being able to find a job, housing, or education, or just be able to take care of yourself and your family, those things may seem more immediate than saving $75 to be able to go apply and see, even if a person knows that process. So that gap for so many people. But there also may soon is this stigma around having a conviction of, I imagine there are people who say, look, I've been able to eke out some kind of existence. maybe I don't want to broadcast that I've had this conviction or that I am a person who would be eligible for this. Have you found it to be difficult to get people to speak on the record? Or are people saying, look, I want you to know so that you know who your neighbors are or who's around?
Yeah. It has been very difficult getting people to speak on the record. I also reported on Clean Slate when I had lived and worked in New York years ago. That was a challenge then in New York, and it was a challenge now in Connecticut. And it makes sense. The whole idea of Clean Slate is to erase records and give these people a chance to move forward. And so any normal person would think, all right, well, why do you want to chat with the press and broadcast this information? Because your name's connected to it. And so that's something we're very cognizant of and something that I was very sensitive to. And when speaking with sources, just saying, listen, like, what are you comfortable with? Very clearly outlining, listen, like, this is going to be in a news story. Your name would probably need to be used if you're comfortable. Yeah, it was challenging to get someone to talk, someone who has been personally impacted. And it took a year and a half to get that person. She kind of just was super receptive and open to it. And she was like, yeah, super happy to chat with us. And I laid everything down. And she was like, yep, I'm ready to talk. And she was very emotional just telling us her story. It was great because she gave people an insight into what that actual experience is.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about as we were preparing for this conversation with you is the changing federal landscape. And the ways that a lot of fears that people have around immigration enforcement, around the federal government subpoenaing records or using records and data in particular ways to promote whatever those interests are, how that complicates something like Clean Slate here in Connecticut. So the hesitance that people have to be on the record with their name, their image, all of those things, as well as for, let's be frank, we are heading into an election year. We are in an election year in Connecticut. And what the issues are that politicians and aspiring politicians are willing to take on, how the advocacy community decides to order its list of demands. All of that political uncertainty leads to this very basic question is, as you look forward with Clean Slate, what is it that we should be paying attention to or that you're seeing in your reporting that we should really be focusing on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last loose strand with Clean Slate in Connecticut is the whole notification process. And state officials have, acknowledged we're working on this. We see this as a problem. They're engaging in discussions, again, with the advocacy community around Clean Slate, which is a good sign. And so I think that's what everyone should have their eyes on. And I know in the legislative session is starting soon here in Connecticut. This might, be something that lawmakers tackle this year, something to keep an eye on. How are these 100,000 plus people going to know their records were erased?
Let me ask you a more personal question as we round this out. You are an investigative reporter, and you've been able to understand the state in a really unique way, but also see how all of these pieces fit together at a time when, frankly, it is difficult to be a journalist and to seek truth and not just opinion. What is it that keeps you coming back to these kinds of stories of being able to put all the pieces together? What is it that moves you as a reporter?
Especially being in an investigative role, I feel very blessed, and I feel like it's almost a luxury to have the time to FOIA state officials and be like, I wonder what internal communications looked like regarding X, Y, and Z. So I feel very fortunate, one, to have the time, but two, I think it's just we're part of a healthy democracy. Public records are a big part of my job, and I think not enough people look into it. Participating in a healthy democracy is super important to me, and I think as a reporter, if we're not asking the questions, who is? Even just engaging with these public officials, even with Clean Slate, it wasn't in the headlines for a while. That's what made it so important for me to just keep pursuing the story, keep pursuing updates, because again, if no one's going to ask the questions, they don't have to say anything. And that's a very important job for us, is to ask those questions for people that, don't have the time to chat up a lawmaker or catch them in a hallway,
We're so glad that you are asking the questions, that you are challenging the status quo in many ways and reminding us as members of this state and of the world that information is ours to see. So thank you for sharing that information.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Maysoon Khan is Investigative Reporting Fellow for Connecticut Public. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, We'll hear from political scientist Joe Sauce and sociologist Joshua Page. They study the predatory dimensions of criminal justice and explain how their research extends beyond criminal justice.
The more we got into this, we saw, this is about gender justice. This is about racial justice. This is about economic justice. This is about the racial wealth gap.
This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the criminal legal system. Now that we've discussed efforts to reform the system, let's talk with two scholars about what they see as ongoing challenges. Joe Sauce is the inaugural Coles Chair for the Study of Public Service at the University of Minnesota. Joshua Page is the Fink Professor of Sociology, also at the University of Minnesota. Their new book is Legal Plunder: The Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice. I asked Josh to tell me more about what they mean when they refer to the predatory dimensions of criminal justice.
The story we tell in the book is one about continuity and change, is that throughout, the history of this country, the criminal legal system has been put to use towards safety, but it's also been about resource extraction. And through most of the history of the U.S., that was focused on labor, right? Whether we're talking about convict leasing, whether we're talking about prison industries, whether we're talking about chain gangs. And in from the 1980s forward, the sort of labor extraction in the system remained, but it got overshadowed by financial means of extraction that really target legally entangled people, their families, and communities to extract money from them. And so we're talking about the bail bond industry, how bail system works, which grew immensely in the 80s and 90s. We're talking about court fines and fees in the 80s onward. There was all kinds of new fees that were created actually with the pursuit of revenue in mind. We're talking about community supervision fees. So when people are put on probation or parole, they're paying what we call pay to stay out fees. You pay so you can stay out of prison. When they go into prison, there's all kinds of fees now for what they're called pay to stay fees that charge everything from, for rent and medical services. And even, people, when they talk about what's happening with the privatization of prisons, it's, people typically focus on prisons that are privatized, meaning that they are owned and operated by private companies. And what they sometimes fail to recognize is if you actually go into public prisons, those are owned and operated by the government. There's all kinds of private industries happening, whether that be for telecommunications, the phone calls, the commissary. If you want to put money on somebody's books who's on prison, you want to deposit money for them, you're going to pay a large fee. So the whole system has been financialized. And what Joe and I try to really show is that, yes, this is about those who are directly involved in the system, the defendants, those who are convicted. But so many of these practices actually operate through tapping into people's families. Right? It's through getting them to actually pay the money for bail, pay the money for telephone calls, put money on the books. And it's actually, that's the only way it can actually generate revenue for both the government and for businesses.
Joe, it sounds like exploitation, not just capitalism at its finest. And I say that because I think of your work that really helps us imagine what the generational consequences are of these different choices or, lack of choice for many families and communities who we know all of the research that says if a person who is incarcerated can remain in contact with their children, those children have a better likelihood of success in life, however that is defined, success in school, success in their behavioral health. And so it seems very difficult to do that. Was there a particular moment or era where we started to see this switch toward making this about revenue generation and increasing the financial cost to either stay in, stay out, or remain connected? When did this move start to happen?
Really in the mid 1980s, particularly first in the prison area, and then into the 1990s is really when you see the first explosion. There's a couple other bursts after that, but going back to what Josh was saying about the transition from more labor focused practices to more financial, if you think about it, if you're going to intensively exploit someone by forcing them to work in various ways in a public or private context, you need to criminalize them and you need to convict them. And under the 13th Amendment, you can force them to work, right? This switch to financial extraction is a huge expansion that happens in these predatory practices. If you think about it, you can actually add fees or fines or seizures, or you can add things at every place in the system. This stuff is spread way beyond incarceration and punishment to every step along the way. And it's a public and private partnership, really, in both contexts. And then, in addition to that expansion, the second dimension is that really it's no longer the person who is arrested or convicted of the crime per se, it's the community that's the target here. The vast majority of people who are paying these bills are not people who are, say, incarcerated, if we're looking in that context. It's going to be people in the community, and disproportionately older women, and particularly moms in impoverished Black and brown communities predominantly. And the extraction is pulling in all the resources from the community, not just taking something from that individual. They're more like the anchor for an operation that's siphoning what little these communities have. And then the third dimension is you can only take labor in the here and now from the person working for you. But once you switch to finance, you can begin to stretch out, in a sense, over time, you can begin to take resources people don't have yet through the mechanism of debt. And so debt imposition and collection becomes this long, perpetual payment trap for people and keeps people entangled in the system for long, long periods of time just because they can't get out from under this, right? And so all of this begins to happen. So if you take the example you said of phones, so in the United States, fairly recently, it was about a $1.2 billion industry per year, but 460 million of that went back to government in the form of commissions. And so what you have is governments, departments of corrections bargaining with private telecom providers, which are actually owned now by private equity firms with investors in this operation in many cases. And they're negotiating, but they're negotiating under context in which both of them have a stake in maximizing the amount of revenue that they can generate, in a sense, from the community. And what we see is in some places where they've reformed these practices and they've made phone calls free, in some cases, calls to home are doubling in their rates, which, as we know, is really good for children, really good for partners and relationships, and for reentry into the community.
Josh, as Joe was talking about this and the role of private equity and the ways that this entanglement between government and private business has become omnipresent throughout the system, I kept thinking of Megan Greenwell's book about private equity and the death of the American dream. And I also think about your work as a sociologist, because so many people have said over the years, well, if people don't want to deal with the consequences or the collateral consequences, then they just shouldn't break the law, right? To make it solely about individual responsibility. What Joe has just laid out is that in some ways it isn't even so much about the person or the individual who has been accused or convicted of a crime. It really spreads out to families, to neighborhoods, to communities that then can have an impact on every institution of public life in this country. How do you meld together that reality that there is that entanglement between government and private interest, and also the reality that this is imperiling the future of the American dream for all of us, not just those who are accused? How do you reconcile that as a scholar?
Returning to one of our earlier conversations about criminal justice, right? The more we got into this, we saw, this is about gender justice. This is about racial justice. This is about economic justice. This is about the racial wealth gap, right? And one of the key moves we make in the book is to say, let's not just stick in the area of criminal justice here. What's happening, what we're describing is a broader phenomenon, right? You see it in the broader political economy. You see it with subprime lending, right? You see it with payday lending. You see it with pawn shops. You see it throughout the community, right? This is a broad, so what we use the term predation, it's not specific to criminal justice. We're focused on how it's operating in that area, but it's a broader shift in the political economy. And it's about, as scholars like Matt Desmond and others talk about, like when we're thinking about poverty, we often talk about what's wrong with the people who are poor, what kind of skills do they need and so forth. And when we don't really focus on, well, a lot of poverty has to do with the fact that people are making money off of it, whether it be landlords, whether it be businesses, whether it be government, right? And so we try to connect what's going on with poverty and what's going on in communities with what's, happening all the way at the top of Wall Street and private equity. It's like people are poor in part because others are generating revenues from, their desperation, their vulnerabilities, and their desires. And that's really what we're talking about, how those processes channel people into these exploitative relationships. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's really hard to reconcile what's happening if what we're trying to advance is justice, in the various ways.
Joe, I remember when I first started teaching, I was teaching at a very elite institution. And I had a student come to class one day, and they were just so puzzled because as they were coming into campus, they saw a sign for a cash advance business. And the student said, "Professor, I have no idea what that means. Like, why would someone need to go to a cash advance place? Don't they just take their paycheck or don't they just have direct deposit?" And I kept going, I don't think I'm really understanding your question. And so the student repeated it. And it made me realize, many people don't realize the ways that people are exploited because of that economic vulnerability, be they immigrant workers, be it people who are living not just paycheck to paycheck, but week to week in order to do that and then have to go to these places, as Josh mentioned, in order to get some short-term relief to a much longer-term problem. Are there particular places in the U.S. that do a better job of addressing some of these things that you all have mentioned about these predatory dimensions that then could become not necessarily an exemplar, but maybe a template of what's possible when people make policy choices to disrupt some of those exploitations? Where should we be looking?
The connection to sort of this student being mystified by this operation, why don't they have a regular bank, is really at the heart of our sort of approach in this book, which is a couple things. One is that we along with scholars like Kyung Yamada Taylor and Louise Seamster use this concept predatory inclusion, which is to say that in most accounts of inequality in liberal societies and in the academy, what we get is an emphasis on exclusion. Things are good for some people. The system is basically good. The problem is some people have been kept out. And that's really important. For example, in the criminal legal side, right, we see things like the mark of a felony record can keep you from getting into a rental housing or mortgage. It can keep you from getting a job. It can keep you from being able to form a relationship. There's all sorts of exclusions that could happen as a result of that. But it's only half of a larger story. The other side of the story is that when you're excluded from normal banking, or from a good job, right, then you find yourself turned into a kind of target. You're ripe for being preyed upon in the sense that now you're subject to payday lenders and pawn shop loans and check cashing operations because that's what's available to you. And they step in precisely because of the situation that has been constructed through other actors denying you things that you need. And same for day laborers and other things, right? And so that's part of what we're trying to say is going on here is that we think about criminal justice, criminal legal systems, and inequality, we need to understand that it's not just about these disadvantages or these sort of exclusions, it's about the taking. And one of the things about that is that when you go to elite institutions to give talk, when I talk about this project, when Josh does, People are absolutely stunned to hear about what's going on, these kinds of takings, and how systemic it is, how widespread it is. But when I go speak in communities where this is happening, I gave a talk at a local bar about these practices, and a friend of mine who was there, who's from one of the communities that's really heavily targeted by these sorts of practices, came up to me and said, "That was great, Joe, but everybody knows this." And it was great to hear him say that, because it really underscored this point that the people this is happening to, this is not a mystery to them, right? In some way. Now, of course, we analyze it in ways that they wouldn't, and they know it in ways that we don't. But I think it is something that not a lot of people know. In terms of who's doing what around the country, I think that it's an amazing time for actually victories that we're having right now at the local level, at the state level, around the country. There's a lot of momentum around bail reform, a lot of momentum around asset forfeiture, sometimes with these interesting coalitions of social justice organizations on the left and some libertarian groups on the right, that, for example, in the asset seizure area. And then there's some areas that have really sort of stepped forward ahead of the others. Like, for example, San Francisco is a great case where you see that in addition to taking a lot of action in terms of banning practices, they've also established an office in government that is dedicated to reviewing these sorts of practices and taking action on them, and in a sense, partnering with advocacy organizations that are contesting them.
Coming up, Joshua Page and Joe Sauce talk more about their book, Legal Plunder: The Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice. They'll discuss the financial burden that the system creates.
83% of the adults who pay for expenses for incarcerated individuals are estimated to be women.
This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about the criminal legal system. We're still joined by political scientist Joe Sauce and sociologist Joshua Page. They're the authors of the new book, Legal Plunder: The Predatory Dimensions of Criminal Justice. In the book, the scholars explore the legal system and how it takes resources from marginalized communities. As part of the research for the book, Josh spent more than a year working as a bail bond agent. I asked him to tell me more about that experience and what he learned from it.
I did this research because there was so little known, so little social science about how pretrial system works in general, but particularly how the bail bond industry works. I've had this long fascination with frontline workers in the, those like policy implementation, and I wanted to know how it works. And there was just there's a fair number of like law review articles about the legality and questionable legality and so forth, but there was so little, and so I wanted to go study it, but I didn't know enough to do, say, an interview study, and there's not one place you can go and just observe. I didn't know how I do a survey, and so I thought the one way I could actually do it is by going inside and actually studying it. And I really believe that to truly understand a culture and to feel what drives people in it, to sort of learn how they make sense of it, good way to do that is through the doing of it. So I got a job as doing it, and it was just incredibly enlightening. I mean, one of the first things I found that became really central to our study was the gender component that started, right? It's like I went into this work thinking I'd be working with defendants who are disproportionately men of color. Quickly realized that wasn't the case at all. They would call the bail bond company, and then we would be instructed as bail bond agents, get mom's name and number. Because the assumption was mom or another woman in this person's life would care enough to bail them out, would come up with the 10% premium, often hundreds or thousands of dollars, and would co-sign the bail contract, which is like co-signing a loan and puts the person on the hook. It's a huge responsibility. And so this really helped Joe and I start to think about this thing that we've been talking about, how these practices draw in families, how they draw in communities. In this case, really how gender constructs the whole thing and how it intersects with race and class. So that was, a really critical thing. It was also through that research that Joe and I had conversations about, wait, a lot of the criminal legal system is operating like a bail bond company. Like you go to court, they also charge fees for service. They're charging people to use a public defender. They're charging for all kinds of things. Oh, wait, that's happening in probation. That's happening in parole. That's happening in the prisons. Joe and I started talking about the bailification of the criminal legal system. There's just so much of the system is now operating like a bail bond company. And so the bail research provided a vantage point on much of the system. So it became a way to actually study all these other domains of the system and not just bail. So that project became, it really started to shape how we thought about this whole book to a large extent. And then it also gave us lots of insights, how much of it helped us understand how it works on the ground, how people make sense of it, how they come to see what they're doing as reasonable, acceptable, right, which is really critical to understanding how policies are implemented as well as how they continue.
One of the things I really appreciate about this book and about the care that the two of you take in your scholarship is that you are really attacking and dismantling this very simplistic binary that too often we see in this field of these people are good, these people are bad, and we need to govern in that way by pointing out to us what the incentives and disincentives are for all of the different actors and players in the system and the process, for understanding how this behemoth system has an impact on, as you mentioned, Josh, frontline workers, be they bail agents or correctional officers or the people who are in charge of ensuring that the person who was given community service to avoid jail time is paying for the insurance that they need to work on a work crew because of all those liability things. And then, Joe, to talk about the families and the gendered notions of this. But I'm also curious about the age in this. What is that piece of it? Are there usually an impact on older women or younger women? I'm thinking of within the social welfare system, the ways in which grandparents and great-grandparents are now having to raise young people that they thought they were far removed from that. How does age as an identity or factor play into what you're seeing?
Well, I think that the effects are really across the life course, but different and in different stages of the life course. Obviously, as we were saying, there's a lot of mothers out there who are bearing these expenses. 83% of the adults who pay for expenses for incarcerated individuals are estimated to be women. That's a very large number. And a lot of those women have children of their own, or they're taking care of the children. They're older women who are taking care of the children of the individual who is incarcerated. And what you find is that the expenses that they have, many of which are these predatory practices, but they extend beyond that. For example, if you may have to move if your loved one is incarcerated and they are sent to another state or whatever it is, there's just a tremendous, drain on resources in all sorts of ways, especially through these predatory practices. Well, what then happens to the home in which those children are living? There have been some studies of what happens when one of the siblings in a family is pulled into juvenile criminal legal systems, and then the parents are subjected to all of these new bills continuously. And what they found is that there are considerable negative effects on the other children in the family, because you're now living in a home where there just simply isn't money for investment in the child, and in some cases may wind up getting the family involved in a situation that is deemed neglect in child protection systems, because that's so often associated with just living in poverty. So there are really, a wide spectrum of effects. And because resources are often held in greater stores later in life, it can be especially damaging for elders in communities at the time when they're heading into their period of their life when they're least able to generate new income.
I want us to go back to something that you mentioned a little while ago, Joe, and talking about when you did this book talk at a bar. First of all, I love that you had a book talk at a bar. I need to think about that for my next project. And that one of the people there said, well, everyone here knows that. We had this period in the 2000s where a lot of people were talking about quote unquote criminal justice. A lot of people were talking about punishment. Scholars were doing that. You know, Josh, your field of sociology has long pioneered that. Political science was a little slower in coming into that fold. You know, I can make fun of my own discipline. But a lot of scholars were talking about this work. A lot of everyday folks were talking about it. You saw even people like Newt Gingrich saying, oh, we need to do something to change the system. I don't really hear that discourse anymore. It is not a campaign issue that we heard in prior iterations in the not so distant past. It became somewhat of an issue in the presidential election of people saying, well, do we want a former prosecutor to represent these communities? But it is not the focus that it used to be. I wonder from the two of you, what you make of this current political moment and climate, given that the things that you discuss in this book stretch beyond political party and ideology, but are so important. What do you make of this moment in the work that you're doing?
Well, I would actually start with the book that Josh wrote before this one with co-authors called Breaking the Pendulum, where they really emphasize how if you step back and you're sort of looking at all of this, it can look like a pendulum swinging back and forth, like where, you know, it goes in a strong direction one way and then comes in another direction. But when you look closer, there's nothing natural about this. It's not working like a pendulum. It's about political mobilization. It's about people making demands. It's about political struggle, right? And what we see is different outcomes at different times of those struggles. And we sort of drain away the human agency and our own responsibility in some ways when we think about it, just like, oh, the pendulum's going to swing in the other direction. People are making that happen. And when you look back after George Floyd here in Minneapolis was murdered on the street, and we had a huge uprising, what you saw was institutional shifting. You saw responsiveness to the demands in the streets. You saw responsiveness to the policymakers and politicians who were moved by people from the communities rising up like that. And that moment, as all moments do politically, eventually passed. And we're now in a different moment. Of course, at the federal level, we have the Trump administration and sort of MAGA governance, which is obviously not at all friendly to reforms of these sorts of practices, and in fact is dramatically expanding them in the area of immigration, immigrant detention, and the like. But if you look at the state and local levels, one of the things about this moment is that we've lived with mass incarceration and saturation policing now for so long that many of the people who are in office have passed through some significant conversations at some point about how counterproductive this is for other goals that they have, and certainly for the communities themselves. And we're living in a period where some people who were maybe a little, wanted to cling to that centrism, in the Democratic Party, for example, and not do anything that struck them as too radical, are starting to get the sense that maybe they need to sort of jump in a little bit more, and that the time is now, and that there's some urgency, and that we have to fight for these things. So it's actually a really opportune moment in many ways at those subnational levels. And even in some red states, we've seen some movement on some issues, at least.
Josh, scholars don't usually use the language of hope. But I think that this is a moment to think about possibility. As Joe said, this could be an opportunity to move some things forward and not just think about the national level, but the state and the local level. So if we use that phrasing of hope and possibility, is there a particular area that you're focusing on to say this is ripe for the kinds of change and reform that would be instructive and have impact?
One of the areas that's had the most movement in recent years is around prison phone calls. 6 states now have made it so it's completely free to make phone calls. And now we're starting to get some research on that. As Joe has mentioned earlier, The volume of calls has gone way up. When the volume of calls goes up, it increases family connection. People are starting to study it, the effects on order and so forth inside of prisons. And so, these political scientists think of as demonstration projects that others can then sort of say, hey, the sky is not falling. There are ways to finance that. It takes some political will, but it's possible. And it has these positive benefits, both for, those who are incarcerated, but those on the outside. But this is never a simple story. It's, as Joe said, part of my work has been on the sort of contestation of this. At the same time, you have that at the federal level, the FCC under the Trump administration has just rolled back rules that would have decreased the price of prison phone calls across the country. So, it's a give and take, but I think that is one area that's quite rich. Bail reform has been something that's really gained momentum. Illinois became the first state in the country to completely eliminate financial bail, which is very important for various reasons, but financial bail is the main enabler of financial extraction in the pretrial process, right? So when you get rid of financial bail, you don't completely automatically get rid of financial extraction, right? People can still be charged for ankle monitors, for drug testing, for all kinds of things, right? But that is the main source of it. And so not only does it make it more fair, and if it's done right, decrease pretrial detention, but it eliminates the main enabling factor that allows so much of this money to be drained out of communities. But at the same time, the House of Representatives just passed a bill that would bring cash bail back to Washington, D.C. I don't know where that's going to go with the Senate, which is just really ironic. D.C. is held up constantly as one of the gold standards of pretrial systems. It has an appearance rate for defendants upwards of 92%. But again, it's not just that. Moving back to cash bail, we would want people to see is not evidence-based and problematic for public safety, problematic for appearances. But if that were to bring back cash bail, it would likely bring back the bail bond industry, which would, again, then drain these communities out of tons of money that they're currently not paying. And so part of the, motivation of this book is to help people see the importance of that too, which is completely lost that I see in this debate about what's going on with DC. Nobody's really talking about what that would mean for the, the financial, for the economic well-being of, low-income communities, particularly low-income communities of color.
I appreciate the depth of this book, the texture of this book, and the reminder that in this domain, progress always seems to come in fits and starts. But when the progress comes, it is because of a commitment of people in various stages of communities, various positions. It doesn't require title, but it requires a willingness. And I think as we think about the future of the criminal legal system and the ways in which this really imperils the well-being of so many people, that's what we have to cling to, and to imagine what could be done differently by being inspired by what is already being done. So I appreciate these two amazing scholars for sharing their work. Josh Page is the Fink Professor of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Joe Sauce is the inaugural Coles Chair for the Study of Public Service at the University of Minnesota. Thank you both for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
To learn more about Clean Slate in Connecticut, you can listen to our 2023 interview with Helen Caraballo. You can also learn more about the criminal legal system by listening to our 2024 conversation with James Foreman Jr. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon Aiken, Erica McIntosh, and Meg Fitzgerald. You can listen to more than 250 episodes of Disrupted in our archive. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you love an episode, please remember to leave us a comment. You can listen for new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.